Hi, hey, thanks for coming to my talk. I like to start my talks usually talking about something kind of ridiculous and off topic, and then hopefully we'll bring it on topic. And I don't want you to disclose any personal health information. So, like, if you do have high blood pressure, like, you don't have to raise your hand. Just make a mental note of it. But, like, if anyone wants to admit they have high blood pressure, if you don't, it's okay, because I'm going to admit that I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure. It's fine. I take medication. But it's something that you start thinking about some of the things you do that might impact your blood pressure, like standing up on stage and giving a presentation, or drinking coffee. How many people here drink coffee? Right? I love coffee. There is nothing like that first sip of hot coffee in the morning. But now, as I've disclosed, I also have high blood pressure. So these two things could be at odds with each other. So I wake up every morning, and I take my blood pressure medicine, drink 12 cups of coffee, and I'm the same. Like, they just cancel each other out. I'm like, what am I doing? But I love coffee too much. So my wife, people that are married, right? My wife loves me, even though sometimes that can be tough. But she's like, I'm really concerned because you drink a lot of coffee and you have high blood pressure. And I'm like, well, if you search the internet long enough, anything can become true to support, like your bad habits. So some research suggests coffee can lower the risk for high blood pressure. Now, I could probably say that really quick, and it probably wouldn't get past my wife, because that's only for people who don't already have high blood pressure, right? But we can find lots of studies that may support drinking coffee if you have high blood pressure. So then, the hacker, skeptic, nerd in myself is like, well, okay, so like how much caffeine is safe and how much caffeine is in a cup of coffee? And this seems to be like a very debatable thing on the internet. Roughly 95 milligrams of caffeine in a cup of coffee. And I'm like, well, like, what's a cup of coffee? Like my giant Yeti mug that holds almost like more than half a pot of coffee. Is that a cup? Is a cup like, is it 8 ounces in a cup? Because that's just like a little espresso for me in the morning. Because I bought this really nice coffee machine and it makes all this wonderful coffee. So I drink a lot of it. So like what's a cup? But that also begs the question of, how am I consuming my coffee? How am I brewing my coffee? Where am I getting my coffee from? Which may have different amounts of caffeine, which also could have different amounts of caffeine depending on how I'm drinking it as well. So this starts to question the supply chain of my coffee. How much can I safely consume? Now I start to scrutinize the supply chain of my coffee and wanting to measure it. So I take to the internet and I go to ChatGPT. And I'm like, I really need to know how to measure how much caffeine is in coffee. Now, turns out the entire lecture could probably be about each of these methods that ChatGPT told me, which are all super interesting, right? Like mass spectrometry and chromatography, stuff that I can't even pronounce, right? Enzymatic assays, right? Like, I have no idea what all this stuff is. Now, I've read it and tried to understand it, and we understand some of these methods for measuring coffee, chemically separating the caffeine, seeing how it reacts to light, and doing different measurements. They do make the little, I think number 3 is like the little test strips that you could put in coffee. It turns out, because I spent more time researching this than I should have, that just tells you if it's decaf or if it's regular coffee. Like, is there caffeine in it? Is it not? Which is not so helpful for my use case. So I was like, well, maybe I'll just have my own machine at home. Like that could be fun, right? But they're kind of expensive. They're $15,000, like the used version of it. And this performs a chemical, a process that will measure how much caffeine is in your coffee, separating molecules, and then the incorporation of UV spectroscopy. I can't even say that word. Spectroscopy, yes, thank you, allows it to determine the concentration of caffeine in the coffee. I'm like, well, I guess at this point I just have to trust the supply chain, which after my talk at ShmooCon earlier this year, in this talk, you'd be like, well, that really sucks, Paul. We really shouldn't trust the supply chain. In this case, I might have to, unless someone has one of these at home in their lab that I could borrow on a regular basis, because I like to continuously monitor the amount of caffeine in my coffee. So how do we minimize these supply chain risks? I've spent at least a good solid 2 months as a focus on my podcast talking to people about supply chain threats, risks, supply chain vulnerabilities, what those mean. I talk with people way smarter than me and really started digging into the issues surrounding supply chain, much of which led to me being able to give this presentation today. So some of the things that I've been thinking about recently is, well, how do we minimize these risks? And I really think this is a scale, right? If we think about any supply chain, whether it's coffee or whether it's software and hardware that we all have to deal with, I could create everything myself. I could grow my own coffee beans, which I'm not much like a plant, and I really don't get along. So I could create everything myself. I could do the same thing with software as well. I could write all the software that I use from scratch. I don't think many of us want to take on that challenge today. In the middle, where I think most of us land, is that we verify, then we trust, and we work to make the attackers' lives more difficult. That's what I think is the sweet spot, that yes, we don't create everything ourselves, but we also don't just pull everything off the shelf. We do some kind of mixture of it, and we validate what we get in this middle stage. And so I may have all these fancy devices for making coffee, right? I'm not growing it myself, but I'm also not going to the convenience store and grabbing a Starbucks Frappuccino that's already made off the shelf, right? That is the create nothing and do no verification. I'm just blindly going, hey, whatever that Starbucks thing is, I don't even care how much caffeine, I'm just taking it and I'm drinking it. Now, the more I think about this analogy in this slide, when we advise companies today on their supply chain strategy, that you're likely going to do something in all of these areas. That in some cases, you're going to want to create things yourself. In some cases, you're going to want to grab the Starbucks coffee off the shelf and accept the risk. Now, I don't think you ever do no verification. I think still you can verify. But as we look at our supply chain processes in our respective organizations, you're likely going to have a combination of these things going on. Okay, so also in this talk, it's in this unwritten, unspoken contract that I use Linux as my daily driver. Now, and so this laptop up here is running Linux, and it's displaying just fine. Okay. Also, these two are the funniest posts that I've made on social media, and each of these have the one on the left on Twitter has over 1 million impressions. The one on the right on LinkedIn has over 1 million impressions, and I think they're hilarious. So, okay, you can laugh now. It's fine. Thank you. Maybe they're funny when you see them on social media, but it's my way of telling you that a lot of the examples I'll give in this talk will be Linux-based, because that's my daily driver, and I still maintain Linux systems that support the podcast. So a lot of my work deals with Linux. So a lot of my supply chain examples that I will give in tools are specific to Linux. Some of those run on other platforms, such as Windows or Mac OS, but largely they run on Linux. Okay, this will be the kind of premise for talking about the digital supply chain. And again, this was the result of me meeting with lots of people, thinking about the supply chain, and what I wanted to create was a map on how we think about the digital supply chain, because supply chain is an all-encompassing term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. But let's dig into what the digital supply chain is. On the left-hand side, we have the physical supply chain. This is often what we think of when we acquire hardware. When we get a PC, a laptop, a server, an IoT device, it's physical hardware. We should ask ourselves, has it been tampered with? Has someone physically altered the hardware? Now, it turns out this happened. If you search for hunting for backdoors in counterfeit Cisco devices, that's where the bottom image of that physical box is someone actually soldered a piece of hardware onto a Cisco device to tamper with it to install a backdoor. So that's the physical aspect. The next, if we move from left to right, we have what I call, well, what Bob Martin from MITRE called, and I stole from Bob because I think it's a great way of thinking about it, when we think about things such as firmware. Now, firmware is just software that's inconvenient to program. The other thing about firmware is that it's pre-installed. When you acquire a piece of hardware, you don't have a choice of what's installed on that laptop in terms of firmware. I mean, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but for the most part, your UEFI BIOS has to be put together, acquired, and programmed onto your hardware by the manufacturer. It's pre-installed. So my second category of where we need to worry about the supply chain is pre-installed software like firmware. Now, you also notice bootloaders are in there too, but bootloaders are, okay, us nerds, we're going to mess with bootloaders. For the most part, other people aren't messing with bootloaders. It's pre-installed by the operating system. Kernels also might be pre-installed and maybe messed with by, Linux nerds and such. But for the most part, kernels are also largely pre-installed for most user populations. Then we get into operating systems. We customize the operating system a little bit, and that speaks to where I think firmware and there's lower level software sits, is a level of customization and interaction that you have with it. Most users are not customizing firmware, bootloaders, kernels, and much of the operating system. Okay, now, those of us in this room probably are doing all of that stuff with all those things, and that's fine, but most of our users that we're supporting are not. Most of our users are in the third bucket there of the digital supply chain, third-party applications, right? When people think about using their computing device, whatever it is, they're using Slack, they're using Zoom, they're using Google Chrome, and that's also each of those pieces of software have a separate supply chain. Now, the fourth box all the way on the right is the one where when we say supply chain, it seems to have taken over this term in our industry. What they really mean is the software supply chain. This bucket for me is software you write yourself. Now, nothing wrong with that, but realize that's a separate supply chain vertical, if you will, where we worry about software libraries. Where do we get our software libraries from? How do we track the transient dependencies within our software libraries? How do we know how much third-party software is included in our software that we're writing ourselves? So that's the fourth bucket. Now, notice the arrows are going from left to right. So I think the further you go towards physical hardware, you get reduced visibility, and validation is hard, right? You got to physically open up the hardware to look and see if there's a supply chain issue. I think as you go towards software developed in-house, you get increased customization and control. I can't really control the firmware that's on my laptop. I'm relying on the supply chain to deliver me that software. We talked about that in the ShmooCon presentation. So this talk is a kind of a follow-up on how you defend yourself from the ShmooCon presentation. So we get that increased customization and control. When I like to think about it, as I work with firmware, largely for my job today, and it's always been a love of mine, a love-hate relationship with firmware. You could say that when I was developing software, I had a lot of control. I could take a library and I could go, you know what? I'm going to write that myself. I'm not going to rely on a supply chain. I'm just going to write that myself, and that's going to be my library. When we move left on this graph, it gets harder and harder to do that. I can't go, I'm just going to design my own chip and solder it on there to replace that. That gets harder, okay? So that's the supply chain attack surface. Now, when we come to the issue of trust, I trust none of it. I don't trust the supply chain at all. I think we need to go into it knowing that we do not trust any link in the supply chain, and we have to verify every single link in the supply chain as best we can. So, and the reason for that is, here's some real-world attacks. Now, I purposely chose ones, aside from the physical, which I won't focus too much on for the remainder of the talk, but the rest of them are examples that happened recently, like late 2022 and into 2023. these are some of the kind of poster child supply chain attacks, and we'll couple these with some of the defensive mechanisms that I've been working on and researching. So, I mean, we'll talk a little bit how these are like physical and firmware kind of lumped into one. So let's start with your TPM, right? The Trusted Platform module, of course, holds keys for things on your system, things like secure boot and other such things. There are a couple of different vulnerabilities with this. One is an older one that I have seen detections for. This is checking for the newer one that was discovered by Quarks Labs. There's actually 2, I believe, vulnerabilities that were disclosed by Quarks Labs. One of them is, I believe, memory corruption, buffer overflow inside the TPM firmware. This software is where you can check for this. It's super hard to find, like, at this level, like, freely available tools to check for some of these things. So I think it's awesome. And so I ran this tool on some of my systems, and, like, lo and behold, I'm vulnerable. I'm like, okay, that's great. What do we do now? Now we've checked the supply chain, and we figured out, oh, the TPM manufacturer has given me software that's on a chip that's vulnerable. What do we do? My best advice. I'm sorry, I don't have great advice for defending the supply chain. So, you know, there might be another talk going on, but that's set it on fire. And so here's the story behind this, is that Yvon Arce and I go way back. He's the founder of Core Security Technologies from back in the day. They were the first sponsor of my podcast. So Yvon works for Quarks Labs. Yvon is the director and coordinator for the vulnerability research at Quarks Labs. It was one of the researchers on Yvon's team that discovered these vulnerabilities in the TPM. So Yvon worked with the researcher and worked the disclosure process for this. In that disclosure process, Yvon goes, you know, let me check my own Dell laptop, okay? Now, I'm not picking on Dell. It's an even playing field out there, right? It just, in this case, it happened to be Dell. Very well could have been HP, Lenovo, or whatever, but it just happened to be Dell. Let me check my Dell laptop. Turns out, he checks his Dell laptop, the TPM is vulnerable to the vulnerabilities that his researcher found. So he goes to the chip manufacturer, and he says, look, this Dell laptop, like on your chip, it's vulnerable. And they're like, well, that chip that runs the TPM is end of life, according to the TPM manufacturer. He's like, okay. He's like, so you're not going to make a fix for it? And they're like, no. He's like, but my laptop is still supported by Dell. So you should expect that Dell's going to go to you and ask you for an update. And when you tell Dell that the chip has been discontinued, they're probably not going to be too happy about that, or maybe, I don't know. I don't want to represent Dell here. So when you go to Dell for Yvon's laptop, there's still no update for his TPM. So that's why, like, set it on fire is the really only way right now to kill that vulnerability. Otherwise, you're just waiting on upstream supply chain issues. So it's good to have the tool to check for it, but we also need a plan on the back end, right? Now you got to start thinking about replacing that hardware, updating it, or using it in a different manner, right? Depending on the sensitivity level of the data or the personnel involved in this laptop. So these are the kind of supply chain problems that we deal with. First step is discovery and pressuring OEMs and manufacturers to get these fixes out there. Another great tool is LVFS and FWUPD. It is a suite of tools for Linux, and it allows you to do a couple things. One is enumerate all the devices and hardware within your system, right? There are ways to do this on all different platforms. I just happen to focus in on the Linux one. This is a great free and open source tool. 2 components. It was created by Richard Hughes, and the 2 components are the LVFS, which is the database of all the firmware that works directly with hardware manufacturers and vendors. They upload their firmware updates to LVFS, the Linux Vendor Firmware Service. FWUPD is the open source, free and open source software on Linux that gives you the set of utilities to enumerate the hardware on your system, enumerate the firmware on your system, and also apply updates to vendors who are participating in the program. So when you're looking at your hardware and considering the supply chain, this is a great thing to use. The other tool, I thought I had another slide. Okay, that's fine. The other tool that I found, and this one was kind of interesting because we were really like figuring out ways on Linux. I want to know what audio drivers and audio stack that I have, and getting that answer easily led me, and I stumbled upon this tool called Inksy, I'll call it, INXI, and it does an amazing job of querying all the hardware on your system and giving you a complete list. Now, if you just run it by itself, it gives you a little bit of output. You can manipulate the command line output to give you a lot of information, telling you which hardware you have, so you can start evaluating the supply chain threats and or risks that you may have. One thing that you'll notice that I'm kind of proud of is that's my desktop, the 24-core Threadripper. It's awesome. It's awesome. And when I built the system, probably 2 or 3 years ago now, I was like, well, I'll upgrade it eventually. And now I'm sitting here 2-3 years from now going, yeah, I still can't find anything that's like will be much faster than what I have now. Like, that's pretty awesome. It's got 256 gigs of RAM, which is impressive. Now, I don't use all that power. It's bragging rights, right? So there. But also, what that means from a supply chain perspective, I built this massive computer that uses my desktop, which I love, but I'm going to have that for like a long time, right? Like, it's not going to get slow or I'm not any time in the future, which means I have to look at and preserve the supply chain of the hardware and firmware components that are on this system. The manufacturer may stop and say, I'm not giving you any more firmware updates. That is end of life right now. Sorry, you're out of luck. I'm not lighting this computer on fire, right? So we've got an interesting situation on our hands. The bigger systems we build the most, the longer we have to support it. I think for me, one of the takeaways is to start looking into some of the open source firmware like Core Boot. My hope is, and we've seen some evidence of this, as Core Boot supports more hardware, open source will continue support where the manufacturer left off. And I think that that is my tip basically for this situation. And the TPM is a harder one because there's probably like licensing and other mitigating factors, but for things like UEFI, for example, Core Boot can come up with open source alternatives where the manufacturer has left off and left you vulnerable. Okay, let's look at some pre-installed firmware in events first. So the MSI breach and the supply chain. Has everyone heard about the MSI breach? A few of you have. So MSI was a victim of a ransomware attack. Now look, I'm just going to tell you like what I've read. I'm not claiming any inside knowledge, so like please don't get me in trouble or stop the recording. I can tell you more. But they're the victim of a ransomware attack. The ransomware threat actors stole 1.5 terabytes of software, including source code, BIOS development frameworks, and private keys. That's one of the dangerous things. Now, we did see Intel had some source code and keys leaked. Turns out that was for BootGuard. Turns out those keys were not pushed out to production systems. They were only used in development, as far as I can tell. MSI, on the other hand, I believe that some of these keys are used in production. This essentially means that the entire supply chain for MSI hardware and any hardware related to the leak is potentially easily compromised by attackers. This means they can create their own signed code to run on your hardware. It is the cryptographic signing of this firmware that prevents attackers from doing this. But once all the source code leaks and the private keys leak, it's the gloves come off and anyone can produce a firmware update. That firmware update will be presented, installed on your system. It'll check out, and that means an attacker now has persistent, very high privileged access to your system that is very, very difficult to detect. So we also, did I say we? I say also it was published that MSI systems had a lack of signature updates. This is something we've been pushing for, is the update package is actually signed so that you're not installing just anyone's update to your UEFI system, that you're installing a signed update from the manufacturer. Some manufacturers don't sign their updates. MSI was one of them. Since all of this stuff leaked, we could go through the leak and go, did you sign any of the stuff? No? Okay. Well then, Eclypsium has a couple of blogs that are summarizing everything that our research team has found so far. Black Lotus is another instance, and this one I particularly love because it's an interesting aspect of supply chain in that, like, I'm bringing my own vulnerable modules or code to the system. I've been seeing a trend as I cover the articles on Security Weekly that once an attacker gains a foothold, if there's not enough attack surface that's vulnerable enough, they'll just bring their own PHP module and put it on there that's vulnerable to your WordPress server. They'll bring their own bootloader. In the case of Black Lotus, and install also has a vulnerability they can exploit to increase their privilege level that allows them to be more persistent, which also gives them greater impact on the system as well. That's essentially Black Lotus in a nutshell. Also slides out of order, so we're going to switch back. I explained all of the so the other part of FWUPD, the reason I put this in here, is there's another feature. So not just enumerating your hardware, so now we're talking about there could be vulnerabilities and conditions in your UEFI firmware that make it ripe for attackers. Well, FWUPD has this great little hardware security module that you can run, and what's interesting is it hasn't been widely publicized, and basically it scans your hardware and firmware on your system and classifies your system into different what he calls host security IDs or security models. So if you fail enough tests, it's basically a score. He's like, you're not at a good security model for your firmware, which is awesome. For you to know. Not awesome because then you have to fix it. But it's a great little, so it's FWUPD, MGR, security. I have to use -- force for certain hardware that it may or may not recognize, and it gives you basically a readout of not just what firmware might exist, but what configuration and other options might not exist on there as well, like Intel Boot Guard. Is it there? Is it enabled? So this is developed by Richard Hughes. He works for Red Hat. I did an interview with him on the Eclypsium podcast, so you can listen to our entire discussion about how the project started, where it's going, and all the things you can do with it. But if you're looking to validate the supply chain, did your hardware manufacturer give you hardware and firmware that was in a secure state? Well, one of the ways you can test that is using free and open source tool. Secure Boot's also like a really good thing to have as well, and I still feel like there's some misconceptions out there, and maybe not with you folks in the audience, but with the community, like larger community. Some people think Secure Boot is, well, that's just a physical mechanism to protect it. Sometimes when I talk to administrators, they're like, well, yeah, I can enable or not enable, but that only protects me if someone has physical access to the system. I'm like, no, Secure Boot is cryptographically verifying every piece of software in your boot process. It's a great protection mechanism against supply chain attacks, because if there is a supply chain attack that doesn't compromise Secure Boot, now we have those as well, that's the last bullet on the slide, and that happens. However, if there are other supply chain attacks that are not bypassing the Secure Boot mechanism, it's a great way to ensure the integrity of your system. However, it hinges upon the fact, and this is a theme that will come up, that you keep your revocation list up to date. Revocation list updating is a hot topic. It's not something we directly have control over. We can. I take that back. We can. If you want to assume all the responsibility for maintaining all of the keys and cryptographically signing every piece of software on your system, Intel and Microsoft developed Secure Boot so you could do that. That's a lot of work and responsibility, so I don't necessarily recommend that. However, then you're relying on the OEMs and manufacturers to update the revocation list because they control the keys. And it's up to you and us in the community to make sure that it gets updated. LVFS, again, FWUPD has done this for Linux systems. You can do this in Windows. Apple and macOS have their own process for that because they control the hardware, firmware, and software more than any other manufacturer. So we basically just have to trust that, like, Apple's good, which we can have that debate. However, if we go back to the Linux systems, Richard did a great job of updating FWUPD to help you update your DBX on Linux. Because on Linux, I still think it's difficult to detect whose responsibility is this to update the revocation list for secure boot. Should it be Microsoft? Should it be your OEM or manufacturer through a UEFI update? Should it be your operating system vendor? Well, if you're using shim and shim is shared by multiple Linux distributions, whose job is it to update all of that software and all those revocation lists? So Richard said, you know what? I can help you with that. And it does a great job of doing it. It flags situations such as if you're going to update your DBX. I was trying to help a random person on the internet with this, and they just weren't getting it because they were trying to update their DBX. And they're like, the update's failing. And it says that my bootloader's in the DBX. I'm like, yeah, that's because you haven't updated your bootloader. And they're like, no, it's up to date. I'm like, no. The hash of your bootloader is in the revocation list. FWUPD is telling you that if you apply this update, when you reboot and you have secure boot enabled, it's not going to boot because your bootloader is in the DBX. It's warning you of that before all those bad things happen. So go update your bootloader. He's like, well, I'll wait for an update to FWUPD. I'm like, no, never mind. Hopefully they figured it out. Okay, let's look at some third-party software. How are we doing on time? Good. 3CX, was that a train wreck or what? Good Lord. The more I looked into this, so now we're talking about third-party software, right? This desktop software that people use. And we've all probably got like little snippets from the story, that we pulled. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But what was astonishing to me was how much of a train wreck. This was a supply chain attack that led to another supply chain attack that compromised software that was for voice over IP for call centers and places like that. They got pushed out to all of the users that did some side channel loading DLLs. Like this is an amazing, you could give a whole talk just on this whole thing right here, but this is most definitely a great example of third-party software in the supply chain being compromised. The vendor also handled it very, 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 very poorly. It was really, really bad. They're like, there's no problem here. They're like Jedi hand, like, there's no problem here. Your EDR must be as a false positive or something. Like, no, your entire supply chain has been compromised. Now, and we're still uncovering the extent of these damages because the Xtrader software was compromised in a supply chain attack. The 3CX builds were compromised in a supply chain attack. And so there's others being affected by this breach, and it just keeps unraveling, and it's a hot mess. So I want to go to a Linux example of third-party software. And it's interesting. This is what set me down the path of getting really interested in supply chain stuff. My day job was getting more interested in supply chain stuff. And immediately when they did that, like I started relating it to me, right? I try and make things relatable to my own experiences. And I was like, I use Linux. Again, I'm obligated to tell you that. It's in the unwritten contract. And on my desktop. So I'm like, I update all this software all the time. And I'm a recovering Ubuntu user. I used to be an Ubuntu user. And what got me with the whole supply chain issue there was I'm running Ubuntu and I want to install software. And if I use Ubuntu's package repos, it's either not there or it's really outdated. So I'm like, all right, fine. Okay. I'll go to Snap, like maybe Snap. And then I'm like, but there's like 2 different Snaps out there, and then Snap does a sandboxing that breaks the functionality of the Snap, but now I also have to remember to update Snap. I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine. Maybe I'll just go to the, like Google Chrome has its own repository, and I'll go to their repo, and then I got to make sure I trust their keys. I got to validate their keys, and now I'm getting Chrome from them. If I want Firefox, I got to disable Firefox in Ubuntu's official one. And then what is the other? Now I'm having a mental blank. What's the other Linux one that they want to use that's like Snap? What is that called? Flatpak, thank you. Then I'm like, oh, then we have Flatpak. But what strikes me about all these different areas is I'm like, someone else is packaging my software, and do I trust them or not? And so I switched to Manjaro and Arch Linux, and I still have the same problems. But I'm not running Ubuntu anymore. Now, I validated this with a member of the Arch Linux security team, who happens to be one of my new friends that came on the show. And I was like, dude, this is really bad. And he wrote me a very nice email. Santiago's an amazing person, and they're working on this issue. He's like, I hear you. He's like, we know about this, and we're working on resolving it, which breeds some confidence in me. They're not just like sweeping it under the rug like some vendors do, right? But basically, this article described a situation where they were able to pull off this attack where in Arch Linux packaging, you as the packager can turn off signature validation for your own software. Now, I believe this feature was put in there if you have something as part of your package that you don't need to verify as part of it. Maybe it's a glob of data that has no security implications in these weird use cases. This is what happens when you make software for everyone. You got to account for all these different use cases. I'm not a fan of the feature because what I discovered is when you're, as the end user, updating the software, the package maintainer goes, yeah, we're just going to skip validation for that. It doesn't give me an option to go, do I accept or not? It just continues on with life. And I'm like, I don't like this, and I think this is one of my tips for all of you in validating and defending the supply chain is question this stuff. You have to really look for it when you're doing things like updating packages. Look for it and reach out to people, right? So now the team is looking at this, and so what happens is if you skip that validation, the other thing you have to do is find expired domains. And you have to take over the domain to deliver that software. And since you can do that and the software is not signed, you can install malicious software on people's devices. And it's all explained in that article. But again, this is one of the supply chain things that I come across. And it's not the only one, right? When you're updating as well, it may ask you to validate a key. And this is where I think we just need to be extra diligent, and this has been a problem ever since we started signing software in any capacity. Now, there's a checksum and a signing process; those are two totally different things. But in this case, I was installing software. Like I want to run Spotify on my Linux desktop. I don't want to have to build Spotify. I don't want to have to like go out of my way. I do want to have some trust that there's a third party that I can trust that will validate this, they'll produce a package that can be validated. However, when I'm updating, it says, do you trust this key? Now be honest. How many, you're laughing already, how many of you, when you're in a hurry, you want to listen to some music, you got a lot of meetings that day, and project deadlines are just going to click yes? Like just yes, yeah, come on, be honest, it's fine, right? What I'm proposing is that we notice situations like this, that we work with package maintainers to come up with more automated ways to validate the key, which is being worked on, so that we just don't click yes, right? And I think this is part of if we're going to start to have solutions for the supply chain, we need to not just be in the mode of clicking yes, but also the update mechanisms need to help us as well, help us do better, help us more easily validate these things that aren't so manual. Okay, let's look at software developed in-house. I love this paper. This might be my favorite security paper of all time. We've joked about it on the show, actually, because when we were talking heavily about supply chain, Josh Marpet would be like, remember, Paul, there's the paper that talks about the compiler inside of the compiler inside of the compiler. I'm like, I know, Josh, I know. And then I got it wrong on who wrote the paper, but it's Ken Thompson's paper, Reflections on Trusting Trust, in August of 1984. I don't know how old all of you were in 1984, but I was in elementary school, and Ken was writing the smartest paper in the world on supply chain security. Does anyone know how many pages it is? How many pages? How many did you guess? 8, Jeff, I know you know. Put your hand down. 8, 2, it's 3. It's 3 pages. I was astonished. I'm like, oh my God. And so you read it, and then you read it again, and then you go, I still don't. Wow. Okay. Let me put it down, and then I'll go read it again. But he really just, it's so densely packed and so eloquently just summarizes software supply chain security. You cannot trust code you did not totally create yourself. I mean, it's, of course, like that. I'm like, oh, well, if we'd listened to Ken 1984, we wouldn't have the supply chain problem. But we got lazy, and we relied on other people's code. I mean, from the beginning of time, we relied on people's code. There were punch cards in a drawer in a central location that people used to share. So we've been sharing code ever since we could write software on punch cards. No amount of source level verification or scrutiny will protect you from using untrusted code. Doesn't matter how much we look at the code. Finding logic flaws and other things is super, super hard, especially as we have millions and millions of lines of code. And roughly estimates, I see that 70% of that code is open source in someone else's software. So I encourage you to go back and when we think about software security, read Ken's paper and then read it again. And I just be astonished that it was written in 1984. So amazing stuff. So we started applying some of those concepts. I am working on, I don't have a date when it's going to be released, but I'm working on a class. The class is centered around vulnerability management. My first task was to set out and build a whole bunch of vulnerable stuff. You'd think that would be easier than it turns out that like it's super hard. I'm like, why is this so hard? Putting up vulnerable stuff, like what it would be like, oh my God, it's vulnerable. It's really horrible. And now I'm like, well, I really want it to be vulnerable. Why is it so hard? But one of the things, and this is like, in order to have supply chain security in your software, you can do the opposite of what I'm doing here. So it's like learning by the opposite. In order to have a really good, reliable, vulnerable system, I had to build a lot of things myself, like literally in Docker from scratch. So I couldn't rely on the upstream because the older stuff, to their credit, Debian and others, like they're taking that stuff down. Like they don't want you to use the older stuff. So a lot of that older stuff will disappear and go away. But I'm like, no, I need that. I put that back. So one way I solved the problem is I did from scratch, which basically just gives you an empty container. The next thing you need in that container is a root file system. I stole an old root file system from Debian 8. I think Jesse, is Jesse 8? I think Jesse was 8 or 9. There's a Debian Jesse build root, and I install that. Now I've got a reliable way. No one can muck with my build root because I downloaded it, I have it. When I build the base container, it puts an old version of Debian in there, and then I can go in and put my stuff that I want to be in every one of my vulnerable containers inside of that, and I build it myself. If you've ever, and then I looked at all of the vulnerable scripts for containers to create containers that are vulnerable, and I rewrote all of those as well, so they were vulnerable in a more reliable fashion. And so I had this really, really great environment. But now, this was to be vulnerable. To not be vulnerable, to go back to the Ken Thompson paper, build stuff yourself. I see so many Docker containers that are just horrible level of security because they're just willy-nilly pulling in components from wherever and not validating. So I think if you have a chance to look at containers in your environment, you should go towards building more things on your own. Don't just do from, whatever PHP application from WordPress, because inside of that is someone else's code that's downloading other people's code and installing on your systems. So try and lean more towards building your own things. You probably don't have to go from this extreme, because this was from a vulnerable lab, but definitely go towards the more build it yourself when you're working with containers. Another way to deal with specifically containers and also libraries is Google's got a pretty new and pretty cool project where right now it's Java and Python. They are producing software packages that are validated by Google. So, I mean, if you trust who do you trust? Do you trust Google? Do we trust Google? They used to say they weren't evil, and then they stopped saying that. So I don't know if I trust them as much. But I do think this project is cool. They produce SBOMs in SPDX and VEX formats. They are applying SALSA artifacts for that. These are all some of the newer projects that are talking about the supply chain. So you can get if you have to rely on I want to go get a coffee and I want to just pull it from the convenience store and drink it, get it from Google because they're doing a higher level of assurance. I think this project they're saying all the right things to me, so hopefully this is successful. So, in conclusion, hardware, firmware, third-party software, application software, develop a strategy based on some of the suggestions I have here. Have a strategy for each of them, right? Though they are 4 distinct areas of the supply chain attack surface. One other thing that I really love as advice is you need to monitor for changes continuously. That is, my best examples, I have, ironically enough, an MSI laptop. This is not an MSI laptop, this is a Framework. Framework did a great job, by the way, with their firmware, but MSI did not. And MSI stopped producing a UEFI BIOS update pretty much right as I bought it in 2020. So what do you do? As I said, you can let it on fire, your TPM example from earlier. What I do is I use software to monitor any changes in my UEFI environment. If that changes, it shouldn't change. If MSI hasn't released an update, it shouldn't change. If it changes, an attacker may have modified it. I do the same thing with my bootloader. If my bootloader changes as a result of not an operating system update that I applied, I want to know about it. So I monitor my bootloaders and go, if that changes, I want an alert, and I want it cross-referenced with my operating system updates. So not only getting a good supply chain from the beginning, but monitoring moving forward is important. SBOMs, I like SBOMs a lot, but I think it's the SBOM comparison that's really where it's at. The manufacturer of whatever component is producing an SBOM, great, take that. Then analyze their hardware, software, firmware, and create your own SBOM, and then compare them, and continuously compare them over time. I always like to thank my coworkers and others that have worked in firmware longer than I have. I learned everything about firmware from reading their research and talking with them. I work with an amazing team at Eclypsium, and I have to give them credit because they make me sound smart. And at the end is just some resources, pretty much the same ones from my ShmooCon presentation that kind of laid the foundation from some of the more technical firmware stuff that speaks to the supply chain. So I don't think I have a slide after that. That was it. So thanks for coming, and we'll take any questions. Do we have time for questions? Thank you. Mold, I can't see it. It says 1 minute. Can we go 1 minute for questions? Yes.
You showed like a horizontal line from hardware through to software.
Yes.
Each of those things is also vertical. So
Correct.
like firmware, are you looking for hardware manufacturer to fix it, or are you going to try and go vertical? Like, and where would you start?
So the question is, where do you start fixing hardware and firmware specific issues? So in my ShmooCon presentation, you might have seen the Spider-Man meme, where all Spider-Mans pointing at each other. Yeah, and each one is, AMD is a Spider-Man, and Microsoft is a Spider-Man. And that's the challenge. Where do you get? You're going to have to, again, sometimes open source is going to give you an update. Sometimes Microsoft is going to push an update for you. So if it's a component, so now we're stepping outside of UEFI. Like, let's say it's some other kind of your EC firmware. Microsoft might work with that OEM to push it out. And there's multiple different ways to get firmware for all of those different components, which makes it hard. If that's really bothering you and you can standardize on a platform, it's what gives like Microsoft Surface and Apple macOS a real advantage because they control more of the hardware, software, and firmware. So like my Surface Pro, so confession, you're a Linux desktop user, you have an emergency Windows laptop. Guilty. Mine is a Surface Pro 3, and firmware-wise and supply chain-wise, it might be the most secure device that I own because every time I do a Microsoft update, a Windows update, it applies all the firmware for me. So, but when we get into the larger ecosystem, yeah, it gets complicated. That's why efforts like LVFS are working to have a central place to put all of those things so we can get updates from a central place. Yes, Richard. Yeah, the question is where do we start with addressing supply chain issues? Do we start with hardware firmware? Do we start with third-party software? I'd like to start at the base layer. I like to start at the hardware level and the firmware level and reach a place, and there's multiple efforts on this. LVFS is working on a method, and there are other things in the works that I can't talk about yet, with the goal being something that I talked about at ShmooCon as well, is I want to go to a place and say, I want new laptops. I want 20,000 new laptops. What about this Dell model? Oh, look, the SBOM is pretty clean. The firmware looks like it's in good shape because LVFS already scanned the firmware. So I want to start in a known good state. So we are developing ways as an industry that before you purchase the gear, you'll be able to glean some information about the supply chain of that device. And that is definitely where I would start. And then when we get into third-party software and all that stuff, then it gets trickier how we validate that on each of those. But if you're not securing that hardware and firmware level, an attacker that gets on that system could persist and gain privileges. Yes. I've not looked into Bootstrap compilers. The term sounds familiar. Yeah, we didn't talk about what was in Ken Thompson's paper. It started with writing a program that can reproduce itself, and that led to what if I put something in the compiler that can backdoor login.c, but then someone could detect that. So the compiler that compiles the compiler will put the backdoor on the compiler so that any program has that backdoor. And Bootstrap compiler sounds familiar, but it might have something I read in passing. We'll talk after. Any other questions? We have next speaker's here. Are we good? I'll be around for a little while. Jason, one last question. Jason. 90 milligrams on average. Thank you.